Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. So I have a signal here. It says it's streaming on Facebook now.
I think we might be live. Yes. So I'm gonna I'm gonna proceed on the basis that we are live. So I'm gonna say welcome to everybody who's listening live, and welcome to all of those who are going to listen later. And I know there will be many of you because we have a very, very interesting guest today. The Honorable Marc Garneau, who is our Minister of Transportation in the federal government right now, but that's not what we're here to talk about. We're here to talk about something far more interesting than transportation. Well, actually, no, we are talking about transportation. In fact, when I put this on Facebook the first time, somebody commented, and I thought it was quite accurate. Was, well, nobody can accuse them of having a tenuous connection to transportation, having been to space. So I think that's very fair comment. So. Listen, thank you very much for taking the time to do this. I know you're a very busy man, and it's that time of year. It's not it doesn't get less busy because things are winding down in Parliament right now for a few weeks, but they're not winding down in any other respect. So I'm incredibly grateful you're doing this. Just so you know, I've been doing this during the pandemic periodically. We've had some I've had a number of guests come on. I won't call it the show. Today I'm ground control or mission control, I guess, but to talk about a variety of things, including COVID related things, but also non-COVID related things, which we're doing today. And I'm just going to say it, this is going to be the coolest one because we're talking to a guy who's been to space. So, you know, all kids are interested in this, but I think all adults turn into kids the moment you start talking about it. So first, let me just say how thrilled we are and just say thank you very much for joining us today.
Well, thank you very much, James. Glad to join you and to spend some time talking about something other than COVID, although you can bring it up if you want, but delighted to be here and to answer some questions.
Well, that's great. Well, thanks. So I'm in Ontario. You're in Montreal. Lots to talk about. This is I found out this is the 20th anniversary of continuous human presence on the International Space Station, and that's what sort of prompted me to do this. Actually, I've got to tell another story, and you may or may not remember this. Shortly after I got elected in 2015, we're all meeting our new colleagues and whatnot. I get a call from my niece. She's 15 now, so she would have been about 11, and she calls me and she's all excited. So I was talking to my dad, and I'm thinking she's calling to talk to me because it's really cool. Her uncle's an MP now, right? She goes, "Is it true you work with that guy who was the first Canadian ever go to space?" It's a true story. It's my niece Tegan. I said, "Yes, Tegan." She goes, "I was learning about it in school, and my dad said you know him." I said, "Yeah, I see him pretty much every day." And she anyway, you could almost feel her eyes popping on the other side of the phone, right? So it's a pretty special thing. So I impressed her not by doing what I'm doing, but by doing it with you. So and I get that reaction a lot because as I said, going to space is one of those things that turns us all into children. So look, there's all kinds of facts and things, but look, let's start with a little bit talking about your career. You were in the Royal Canadian Navy. I know you were an engineer when you started out. Why don't you give us a bit of background on yourself, and we can sort of lead to space.
Well, thank you, James. Yeah, my first career was in the Navy. When I was a little boy, I didn't dream of going into space. I dreamed of going out on the ocean. I thought that would be incredibly adventurous, and I chose to become an engineer because I think I've always wanted to try to understand how things work, and engineering gives you that opportunity. And so I did both. I joined the Navy and really enjoyed my career serving in the Royal Canadian Navy. Got to go to sea, got to do some interesting jobs, and I was quite happy there. I was thinking of a full career, and then one day there was an ad in the paper. This was in 1983, and believe it or not, the ad said, "Canadian astronauts wanted." And I just about fell out of my chair because we didn't have astronauts. We were watching the Americans and the Russians and go up into space, or the Soviet Union in those days, but I didn't think Canada would get a chance. But lo and behold, yes, Canada was being offered an opportunity to go on the space shuttle. And why? Because we'd invented and built the Canadarm, the robotic arm, which the shuttle used, and it was phenomenally successful throughout its whole life. And NASA wanted to thank us. And so they said, we're going to offer to fly a couple of Canadians. And so that's why they had this astronaut recruiting drive. And I saw that and I said, I can't resist this. I've got to try.
Okay, so the Canadarm, that's a good question. I was going to talk about the Canadarm. So the Canadarm was in use prior to your going on the space shuttle. How long it had been in use before you went?
So it went up on pretty much not the first flight, but on the second flight, and that was in 1981. And
Okay.
it was put through its motions. Would it work up there? And it seemed to work very well. And then they started to use it in a regular manner. For example, when I first flew in 1984, they used it to pick up a satellite in the payload bay of the shuttle and to launch it. And so it became very operational from the get-go. And NASA was so impressed with it, the versatility it gave the shuttle, that they just absolutely wanted to say thank you to Canada. And of course, since then, we have built a new generation arm for the space station.
Right.
And very recently, we announced that we would be building another robotic arm, but this time for a space station that would be going around the moon. So we're getting into the third generation of robotic Canadian technology.
Which is, a whole discussion in itself about how proud we should be about, Canadian ingenuity and engineering and robotics. I mean, that's everybody knows about the Canadarm. I mean,
Indeed.
it's been around for a long time, as you say. So, all right. So you found a want ad for a job, which is not the typical thing that people are looking at. So, I mean, also, what happened when you went home that day? Said you're never going to believe what I'm going to apply for. Like that.
Well,
That must have
that's
been a strange
exactly.
conversation.
It's exactly what I did. I showed it to my wife and said, "Do you think I should apply? I can't believe this." And she said, "Yeah, why don't you? Yeah, give it a go." I think both of us thought I wouldn't stand a chance, and this would just be an exercise to to perhaps for me to dream a little bit about the possibility. But 6 months later, after many different stages through the competition, I ended up being one of the six first chosen in December of 1983. And so very shortly after that, in fact, 3 months later, they had to choose who would be the first, and I was chosen to be the first. And later that year, in 1984, I flew in October of '84. So all within the space of a year, I went from being selected to training to flying, which was a whirlwind year, but just an incredible year in my life.
I can imagine. And kidding aside, I mean, you were selected out of a pool of 4,000 people, from what I've read, which speaks. I mean, you went to space. It speaks very highly of you. But I mean, that must have been quite a process to go through.
Yeah, it was a very multi-staged process because they had to bring the numbers down progressively. And I can tell you that I started to meet people when we were down to about 100, and spent, in fact, a whole week when we were down to 20 people. And they were all incredibly talented Canadians. And I was saying to
Yeah.
myself, they could choose anyone here. They're all capable of doing it. And so I felt very, very fortunate to have been chosen to be one of the six original astronauts. And it goes to show that Canadians, there are a lot of Canadians out there that have that sense of adventure and would like to do that kind of experience in their lifetime.
Yeah, well, I'm sure there's lots with the sense of adventure, but there's not lots who have the skill set to do what you did, which is so. Listen, it's a remarkable accomplishment. Obviously, it goes without saying. Now, so you're not a pilot then?
So I am a private pilot, or
You are? Okay. Okay.
I was, but just a recreational pilot. I was not a sort of your prototype U.S. test pilot that was chosen, in the early days, like the Mercury program. No, I was a private pilot and enjoyed doing that. I obviously am not anymore because I can't maintain my proficiency with the job that I have. But no, I was not a military test pilot. I was in the Navy, but on ships.
Well, I'm sure that's interesting to people because most people sort of have this notion that, all astronauts, flew fighter jets before they went to space, and that's not the case. So it was your engineering background that really set you up, and this is good for kids to know too, because I mean, kids do have this conversation. People ask, how do you become how do you become a politician? That's an easier question to answer, but how do you become an astronaut? I mean, there isn't one path to follow.
No, and I get asked that question a lot by young people, so that's very encouraging. A lot of young people are dreaming of that profession.
Yeah.
I say three things. One is you do have to go to university and you have to do a technical subject, whether it's engineering or science or medicine. Those
Yeah.
are fields that we're looking for astronauts in. The second thing is you have to be in good health. That doesn't mean you have to be a great athlete, doesn't mean you have to have perfect vision, but your health has generally got to be good because of the demands of going into space, particularly if it's going to be for a long time. And the third thing is develop your communication skills because one of the really, really important things is to be able to communicate clearly with your crew members and also with the general public when you talk about your experience of going into space. So those are the three things that I've always told kids who are really focused and want to become astronauts.
Well, that's fantastic. So you go through the application process, and then once you're selected, tell us a little bit about the actual training you have to do before you take off.
Yeah, so there's quite a bit of training. Now, in my three flights in space, they were always on the space shuttle. So I had to learn about the space shuttle, all of the systems that are part of the space shuttle. The first flight I was on, I didn't have time to do that. I was really just doing science. I was called a payload specialist. But my next two flights, I was called a mission specialist. And I had to know all the systems on board, whether it's the propulsion systems, the computers, the electrical system, the environmental control system, all of those things you had to know because when you're up there and if something goes wrong, you have to fix it.
Yeah.
Fortunately, you have mission control that's there to monitor what the health of the shuttle is and to give you lots of good advice. But ultimately, you really do have to know what you're doing up there in that vehicle. Imagine if you drive a car and you're out there in the wilderness and something goes wrong with the car. It certainly helps if you understand a little bit about how that car works. There's a chance that you might be able to fix it and keep going on your trip. So training is mainly about that. Now, I also was an arm operator, the Canadarm operator, on two of my missions. So I had to focus on proficiency skills operating the Canadarm and doing specific things. Like I had to capture a satellite that we rendezvoused with. I had to
Yeah.
launch a satellite, that kind of thing. So that was additional stuff. I had to do science experiments while I was up there. So I had to learn how to do the science experiments. The scientists on the ground told me this is how you should do that experiment.
Well,
And we all have a whole bunch of other responsibilities. We obviously have to know how to make food, go to the bathroom, all those things.
okay. I was talking to somebody today. I said, you got to ask them what you do about going to bathroom in space. So we'll get to that later. But anyway, you make it sound like catching a satellite or launching a satellite is all in a day's work. I mean, you move past those things pretty quickly, but those are pretty significant activities. So you've been three times. The second and third time, I understand you went to the space station, but the first time you went, which is in 1984, the space station was not yet operational. Is that right?
Yeah, so in actual fact, my third mission was to the space station. My
Okay.
second one, we didn't go. The space station hadn't, that was in 96, and they had not started really to build the station. But it was after that it accelerated. And when I did my third mission in 2000, 20 years ago, it was, you mentioned at the beginning, it was the 20th anniversary of
Right.
being continuously occupied. Well, we met that first permanent crew on my last mission in December of 2000. And the station was being built at that time. We brought up on our mission the very first big solar panels. Everybody who's seen a picture of the International Space Station sees a completed picture. There's 4 big pairs of wings, if you like, which are solar arrays. Well, we brought up the first ones. It was a small station at that time. We were building it. And again, Canadarm1 played a crucial role in that, because I had to pick up a big chunk of the station that was in the shuttle, and I had to position it so that it had the arrays on it. They weren't opened at that point, they were in boxes, but we had to connect it to the station. And then in subsequent days, we unfolded those arrays, and they were really, 75 meters from end to end, very big structures. And so we were building the station at that time.
So give us a sense, like, how big is the Canadarm?
The Canadarm is about 55 feet long, the one that was in the shuttle. The one that's on the station, I think, is a little bit bigger. It's a little bit more powerful. It's a newer generation, maybe 60 feet. Don't quote me on it, but I think it's about 60 feet long, or about 20 meters.
Okay, so the first time, so you went up in 84, 96, and 2000, if I'm not mistaken.
That's correct.
So in 84, when you went up, how long were you in space?
So that was an 8-day mission, and it was really a fabulous mission because our whole purpose was to observe Earth. So we were always pointing, if you imagine the space shuttle, imagine it turned upside down so that all of the sensors, and I'm talking cameras and radars that are in the payload bay of the shuttle, are all pointing at Earth. And the best windows for looking at Earth happened to be in the ceiling of the flight deck. And of course, it was pointing towards Earth. So we had these wonderful views of Earth during the entire mission, because all the time that we were pointing towards the Earth, we could look out the window and look. And I didn't realize at that time how fortunate I was on that mission, that I got so much time to just gaze down on planet Earth.
So you're in space for 8 days. You're in the space shuttle. Now, how many people were on that mission?
That was the first flight to have 7 people, which was a record. Wow. And
wow.
And it included some very famous people. And one of them was Sally Ride, which most people have heard of, the first American woman to fly in space. So she was on her second mission. And there was another woman, Kathy Sullivan, who became the first American woman during that mission, in fact, to do a spacewalk. So 2 incredible women out of a crew of 7. I was the only non-American, although there was an Australian who had become an American who was on the flight as well. He was an oceanographer. And so there were 7 of us on that flight. And when you look at if you're on Earth and you go into the space shuttle and you look at the place where we live and work, you say, holy cow, 7 people, that's like 7 people in a mid-sized bathroom spending a whole week together.
Well, that was my next question, actually. Yeah. Not the bathroom part, but the size.
The size. But the reality is that people forget, but when you're up in space, you can use the entire volume. So you've got to change the way you think about people having their feet on the ground. They can be up in the corners of the mid deck and the flight deck. So there's a lot more room than you can imagine. And having 7 people on board, really, I never felt in any way that it was cramped.
Okay, so just to give us, the people watching, an idea, how big is it? When you're on the space shuttle on the first mission, are you all in one open space, or are there different compartments, and how big of an area are we talking?
So on the space shuttle, there is the flight deck, which is like the flight deck of a commercial airliner. And
Okay.
So there are 4 seats up there that you use for launch. There's 2 pilots at the front and 2 mission specialists sitting behind them. It's fairly tight. It's like the cockpit of an airliner. Then below that is the mid deck, and the mid deck is the size, I would say, of a medium-sized bathroom. And that's where all the lockers are. That's where you sleep. It's where you eat. It's where you make food. On the side, there's a bathroom. which is very small, about the size of a telephone booth. And now there is an airlock as well, because obviously when astronauts go out and do spacewalks, they go through the airlock. And the airlock, if it's not filled with equipment, also offers you a little bit of extra space.
So when you're inside the space shuttle for that all those days, is it zero gravity the whole time, or are there times when you pressurize it so that it is sort of like being on Earth?
No, you're always floating the whole time that you're up there. And for people who are, in physics and who love that kind of stuff, you're actually, believe it or not, you're in free fall. You're always falling towards Earth, but you're falling at the same rate as the vehicle in which you're located. So you're both free falling at the same rate. So that gives you the equivalent to being in zero gravity, and you are able to float inside that vehicle. So it's you're floating the whole time.
So how do you do something like prepare food or brush your teeth? I mean,
there are some challenges. I
would think.
The nice thing, if you imagine making yourself a ham and cheese sandwich, you can put the slices of bread on the table and the ham on the table and the cheese on the table and assemble them, and it's all very orderly, and cut it. Up there, anything you put down, unless you Velcro it, it's going to float away. So it's a different kind of experience in terms of so consequently, all the food that you get is in containers, and a lot of it is dehydrated, and you have a special water dispensing syringe arrangement that's connected to a hose that allows you to inject water into the container. It's a plastic container, so that you can then rehydrate it. And you have a little oven, a little convection oven, and you put it in there. If it's warm food, for example, let's say macaroni and cheese, and you put it in there, it says 5 ounces of water, and you dispense that amount and you put it in. And then when you take it out, it's still a closed container. The only hole in it was the hole where you stuck the needle in. So now you want to eat it. So you have to get a pair of scissors. We all have our own scissors, and you cut very carefully around. It's a plastic cover, and it's all transparent, and you cut it around it, and you just lift the flap, and then you insert your spoon, and you take out the food and you bring it to your mouth. Now, you don't want to jiggle your spoon or do any of this sort of too quickly, because if you do, the food will start flying all over the place.
Float away on you. So in other words, you don't need a lot of counter space to prepare your food, is what you're trying to
say. Exactly.
Yeah. Well, that's fascinating. I mean, of course, you see these things on news reports and in movies and television and whatnot, but hearing about the actual activity itself is fascinating. So during that 8 days, how many orbits around the Earth would you have done?
So you do 16 a day. So one every 90 minutes. Every 90 minutes you go around the Earth. So you get a sunrise and a sunset 16 times a day.
Wow.
And so it is quite strange to be going into light and then into darkness and then light and then darkness. And it's fascinating, obviously, but 90 minutes to go around the Earth, because you're going at 25 times the speed of sound. You're going at Mach 25, as they say, and that's equivalent, if people want to do the math, to traveling at 8 kilometers per second. So 8 kilometers per second.
Okay.
If you imagine that, for me to get to Collingwood would not take, where you are right now, would not take me that many minutes if I went in a straight line. Yeah.
So on your first trip there, your first space mission, what's your greatest memory, your greatest visual of the Earth? Just if there was one, and this may be an unfair question, frankly, as I say it out loud, but if there was one takeaway, one visual, one thing, what would that be?
Well, obviously, the first time you get to look out the window, and what happens is after you've gone through this really, really powerful experience of the launch, which releases all of that energy and takes you from a standstill to space in 8.5 minutes, the roar, the power, the acceleration, when that's all finished and the motors are turned off, it's suddenly very quiet.
Yeah.
And you feel yourself floating in your seat, and you, as soon as you can, you take off your seat harness and you just float out. And that's a magical moment. And the first thing that you want to do is to go over and look out a window to see, am I really up there? Am I really up there in space? And when you look down, by the time that I had the chance to look down, we were already over Europe. We had launched from Florida, we had crossed the Atlantic Ocean, and I was looking down and I was trying to say, well, where are we here? Is this France? Is it Germany? Is it Central Europe? And just that incredible sensation. And then looking at the limb of the Earth, which was curved, and realizing that you are floating over the top of the Earth and that you're surrounded by the blackness of space. So what all I think astronauts will remember and tell you, and I don't think my answer is any different or original compared to anybody else, is that first opportunity to see Earth from above, from that vantage point, which is so extraordinary.
Yeah, I can't imagine. I was going to say I can imagine, but I can't possibly imagine. So I've got some questions coming in on Facebook. Here's one. It says, are there still good scientific reasons to send people into space, or are there computers and robots controlled from Earth now able to do the necessary work just as well? That's a good question.
It's a very good question. It's one that's come up very often because it's cheaper to send a robot than to
Yeah,
send human beings. So let's say we go on to Mars, which a lot of people would like to do.
yeah.
Do you send robots first or do you go with people? I think there are compelling reasons to send robots first for some reasons to basically answer a number of questions and figure out some of the things that you can do from a scientific point of view, but also from a technology point of view before you commit to that very much bigger step of sending people. So I think there is a logic for having robots, but there are some things that only humans can do. We are
Hmm.
infinitely more sophisticated than robots. I have come to that conclusion in my lifetime that despite the fact that robots today are incredible compared to what they were when I was a little boy, they're still millions of steps behind what the human mind is capable of doing. So
Yeah.
some of the more important work, even with artificial intelligence, doesn't approach what a human can do. And so I think there is a good argument for sending humans on certain missions. Obviously, we're not going to send humans to Venus or to Saturn because it's not survivable. But
Hmm.
places where we can go, such as the moon and to Mars, I think eventually we should send them.
Okay, so I've got one other question, and this I have a lot of I do a lot of work with the Irish communities. I think you know. So I've got a question here. It's not particularly related to space necessarily. It says from Eamon from Ireland. He said, "Did he sail to Ireland, and does he have Irish connections?" So I don't know what
I
that's
did
got to
say,
do with what we're talking about, but
believe it or not, amazing, Eamon, that you asked that question. In 1969, I sailed across the ocean in a sailboat from Newport, Rhode Island to Cork, Ireland.
really,
I did a 20-day crossing, and we were celebrating the 250th anniversary of the Royal Cork Yacht Club. And so the first part of the question is, yes, I've sailed to Ireland and spent a lovely week there. But secondly, I probably have some Irish on my mother's side if I go back a few generations, but nobody that I'm aware of today as a relative living in Ireland.
well, you wouldn't know this, but on Friday I introduced my private members motion. It was to declare the month of March as Irish Heritage Month, and I talked about all of the historical contributions that the Irish community has made to Canada and in Quebec. I mean, to this day, about 40% of the Quebecois population, legitimately lay some claim to Irish ancestry, and so it's a big part of your province.
Absolutely, and here in
Yeah,
Montreal, the
yeah,
Irish are well known.
yeah.
Griffintown and St. Patrick's Basilica, and yeah, very proud Irish heritage.
Okay, I better not get off on that tangent, or we'll never get back to the space program. but no, that's fascinating. Okay, so let's skip ahead to your third mission. Let's talk about the space station. How long was that journey?
That was a 11-day mission, and
Okay.
so what we had to do was to launch in the shuttle with a specific purpose of rendezvousing, which means meeting up with the International Space Station, and that takes a couple of days to sort of come in, and then you position yourself right underneath it, and there's an airlock arrangement that you have to connect to. And when that is connected, then you can send people through it and go into the International Space Station. And when we went, there were 3 people on board, 2 Russians and 1 American, and they were the first crew to permanently inhabit the space station. And we brought them food, we brought them water, and of course we brought them a big piece of the space station. The fact that I brought that we installed the first solar rays was now going to give them 20 kilowatts of power on a
Wow.
constant basis. So they didn't have to worry about having enough electrical power. And of course, they gave us some stuff to bring back to the ground, some results of scientific experiments. And that has been going on ever since, constantly, since that time for 20 years, as you say.
So were you the first? So they were the first residents of the space station. Were you their
Yes.
first visitors?
We were their first visitors. Yes, indeed.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah.
So that must have been quite a emotional experience for them and for you. I mean,
They had grins on their face from ear to ear because, even though being an astronaut is an extraordinary experience, we're all social animals and social creatures, and we
of
do
course,
like visitors. And
of
and
course, yeah.
they were just so happy to see us, and of course we were very happy to see them. It was a new dimension in terms of going into space. We were actually going to a place and meeting up with some people and spending some time together.
And so there was 3 of them there, and there was 3 of them with you on the shuttle. So there was 6 in total.
So on the shuttle we were 5, and
5. Okay.
so there were 8 of us inside the station for several days.
And did all 5 of you leave then together?
Yes, we did. We did.
So
This was not an exchange. No.
So as happy as they were to see you when you arrived, they were probably more sad to see you go because I don't know when the next time they had visitors was, but it's
Well, a little while later, we'd like to think that they missed us when we left.
I would think so. Now, okay, so about the space station itself. So just physically, what does that consist of? How big of it? How big is it? What is so
So
describe that to us?
So I mentioned that there are 4 big sort of solar wings. These are the solar arrays. And if you were to go and they go right to the extremities of the station, there's a large central beam that crosses the entire station. And attached to the center of that are a whole bunch of modules. And those modules are where people live. So there's a Japanese one, there's some Russian ones, there's American ones. Some are for living in, some are for experiments. And so all of us as partners, the Europeans are there as well, the Japanese, the Canadians, our contribution is the robotic arm, but also another robot that I haven't mentioned called Dexter, which is a 2-armed robot, which is the most complex space robot ever built because it's a 2-armed robot and is used for fine tasks. So all of that is there. But if you look at if you go from the 4 corners to measure the size of the station, it's equivalent to more than 1.5 football fields. So I think
Oh,
people can
wow.
imagine that. And so it's very, very big when, and of course I haven't been up there with it completely built, but I can imagine how big it is having, added one piece to it.
So there's when you talk about these different like the Canadian module and the Japanese module, are you talking about So when Canadian astronauts go there, that's their. That's
So so no, it's all belongs to all of us.
okay.
We didn't build a module. We built all the robotics on the
Right.
station.
Okay.
But there, other countries, their contribution would be modules. But there is no, if you like, ownership of a particular
Okay.
area,
Right.
and we have a common area where we eat and sleep. And so even though the crew is international, we're really tightly integrated together.
And it's still completely zero gravity the whole time you're inside the space station?
Yes, the whole time you're there. Yeah, absolutely. And of course, today they're getting visitors now with the new Falcon rocket that Elon Musk's company developed. They can bring crews up there from the United States, and they can also bring up sort of provisions and other things.
I was going to get into that. I mean, sort of space travel as a, for non-astronauts, but and I will get back to that. I have another question here. It says, is there any update on the development of Canadarm3 project? What impact do you think it will have on the aerospace industry? That's an excellent question too.
Yeah, so there is going to be a Canadarm3, and it's for the Lunar Gateway project because the United States decided it wanted to go back to the moon. And, back in the late 60s with Neil Armstrong and early 70s, there was a race to the moon. And the United States clearly won that race, but they left after a certain number of missions and nobody went back to the moon. And now there is a renewed interest in going back to the moon for a whole bunch of reasons. One is to do some science that wasn't done, perhaps set up some observatories because you have no atmosphere there, and perhaps use it as a sort of staging ground to go on to other parts of our solar system, such as Mars. So the U.S. has decided they want to go back, and they are looking for partners, and the United States approached us a little while back, and Canada decided that yes, we wanted to continue our involvement, which has been great since the beginning of our space
Mm-hmm.
program. We've always worked well with NASA, and so we'll be part of that, which is very, very exciting. And they've asked us again because they recognize Canada's expertise to build the robotics. This time it'll be even more challenging because the robot that we're going to build, Canadarm3, will use artificial intelligence and will be able to do tasks without being controlled by a human being. So when I operated the arm on two of my missions, I was holding controllers and I was operating the Canadarm, and it did what I told it to do. Here
Right.
we're talking about an uninhabited lunar sort of station that's going around the moon with the Canadarm on it, and it may be visited, and it has to do the stuff without being controlled by a person. So it's going to be a very demanding, newest generation robotic arm capable of doing things using artificial intelligence.
So, okay, so we've talked about going to the moon. So going to the space station, I think you would take a couple of days to travel and make the connection.
Yes,
Did I hear
in
that
an
right?
emergency, yeah, no, you're right. Typically, it takes 2.5 days to sync up, and but you can do it faster if you take a particular approach to it. But normally, it's a 2.5 day evolution. Yeah.
So going to the moon then, is it a twice as long, three times as long? What's the
So typically, if you go back to the Apollo days and
Yeah.
the similar technology would be used, it's about a 3-day trip to get to lunar orbit.
Okay.
Yeah.
And would you be able to use the space shuttle, or would you be using the same sort of
You would be going back to rocket technology with
right.
different stages, much like in the Apollo days, but obviously newer generation. What was special and unique about the shuttle was that it was designed to actually be able to come back and land on a runway. So it
Right.
had those little wings that you needed. So different technology, but now I think that we're clearly going back to a more traditional, but probably a more reliable technology, which is rocket technology.
Okay, we've only got about 5 minutes left, and I have about 150 more questions. So I'm going to have to pick a couple here. But describe the time when you're re-entering when you're coming through, entering the atmosphere. How long does it take? What's that like? What's going through your mind the first time you do it, or I guess any time you do it?
So you're going at 25 times the speed of sound, and so very fast. And what you've got to do is to slow down so that you're only going at about 200 knots, or like a little over 230, 40 miles an hour when you hit the threshold of the runway at the Kennedy Space Center. So you've got to bleed off a huge amount of energy. And you do this by slowing down as you re-enter the atmosphere and run into all those molecules that are in the atmosphere, and of course get progressively denser as you're coming in. That of course creates quite a bit of heat on certain surfaces, and when you're on the flight deck, you actually see a kind of a pink or orange glow around the shuttle because it's warming up, and a lot, and even some sort of firework kind of effects, which are quite spectacular. So you're seeing this, and it takes about 55 minutes, as I say, to come back and to be at the Kennedy Space Center. And what this to me is the most miraculous part of the space shuttle. You've got computers that will guide you all the way back to that runway. And although it's theoretically possible to land the runway without any pilot intervention, it's never been done because pilots always wanted to do the landing themselves. But it could take you all the way to the runway. And that to me has always been an amazing part of it. Now, as all this is happening, you're being reintroduced to gravity. So suddenly from floating for 10 days or whatever, or in the case of some people longer, and suddenly finding out, oh my God, I'd forgotten what gravity was like. It can be quite a heavy experience, if I can put it that way. I can remember holding a camera and I was taking pictures out the windows, and suddenly this tiny little camcorder I was holding was starting to feel heavier and heavier and heavier. It only weighed, I think 10 ounces, but it felt like it weighed about 20 pounds in my hands because I'd forgotten what gravity was like.
Right.
And so that's happening at the same time.
Okay, so that's because we've all seen, anybody who's seen Apollo 13, there's that tense several minutes when they're entering the atmosphere and they lose contact and they're not sure that, and in the movie anyway, I assume it's true that it took much longer than it was supposed to, and so there's it must be quite a sensation actually going through it yourself.
Yes. Now, today, unlike Apollo, we have there are satellites above that are called TDRS satellites, and so there's never really a loss of contact with the ground. In the Apollo days, they relied on communications from the ground, which, as you went through a very dynamic phase re-entering the atmosphere, the communications would not get through to the capsule. But now today, we don't have that dramatic sort of 6 minutes of, I wonder how things are going.
So during that 6 minutes, you're in touch with, you can speak with people.
Yes, all the way.
Okay,
all the
okay.
way.
I didn't know. I shouldn't have asked you that. I just destroyed the whole myth for people. Okay, so my last question, then I want to talk about something else very, very briefly, and then we'll wrap up. But so space tourism, how realistic do you think that is? I mean, because as you say, Elon Musk is, talking about this, and is it realistic? How far away from are we from it becoming a reality? And is it something we should even be pursuing, I guess, is another question.
It's realistic. I mean, some people have paid to go up into space. The Russians have taken a number of people. The question is, to be realistic, first of all, I think it's going to continue to be expensive. So only certain people will be able to afford it. And secondly, it's going to take longer than people think. Is it viable? Yes, it is viable. Will it eventually happen? Yes, it will be. It will be possible, but only for certain people. Now, there will be the modified sort of like Virgin Galactic ride, which is what's called a suborbital, which fires you up and you go about 150 kilometers up and you arc over and then you come back down because You're not going fast enough to stay in orbit, so you come back down. That kind of ride, thousands of people have already bought their tickets for when that will begin to happen. And in that sort of arc at the top, you will float for about 5 to 10 minutes, perhaps, and you will have a chance. You'll be up in space and you'll be looking out. And so it'll be like a very compressed space experience, but a short one. And I think some people would like to have that adventure of the launch, that short period up there, and then of course coming back down. And they're going to have to sign waivers, obviously, because going into space will never be a totally safe experience.
Okay, I lied. I keep thinking of more questions I want to ask you before I let you go here. But so when you come back, when you land, you get on the ground. There's questions about what the sensation is like when you get out and put your feet on the ground. But what's the sort of first reaction, first thing you want to do when you get back to the planet Earth?
Is see your family, I think,
Yeah.
to tell them about this incredible adventure that you have just lived.
Yeah.
You do, some people feel very wobbly. I mentioned reacquainting yourself with gravity. Some people have trouble sort of standing up for a bit, and other people don't seem to be affected at all by it. And
Okay.
and they're ready to play tennis, but others would rather sort of just take it easy that day or for a few days after that, especially if you go up there for 6 months. But the
Yeah.
first thing that I wanted to do was to see my family.
I bet. I can only imagine. I can only imagine. Well, look, as I said, I could go on and on and on, and I'm sure people listening would love me to, but I don't want to take up your entire afternoon. But I do have to talk about the Royal Astronomical Society, which, as you know, their Canadian headquarters are in my riding, something I'm incredibly proud of. And much like my niece, when I first went there after I was elected, all they wanted to do was talk about you. So because I worked with you, but which of course is fine by me. But I don't know if you remember this or not, but the gentleman who runs it had a photograph which he sent to me and I sent to you by email, and it was of you walking onto the space shuttle. I believe it was in I don't know if it was 84. I'd have to go back and look. But
What color was my hair?
yeah, I think that's a good question. It was, and it occurred. I would have looked it up before we got on, but it occurred to me as I was just a few minutes before we went online. But he has this picture, and it was an incredible photograph, and he's so proud of it, and rightfully so, because wherever he was, it's just a great picture. It's like you're walking onto the space shuttle or through this gangplank, and it was really remarkable. So but they're a great organization. They do tremendous work, as you know, and they're very proud of our space program. And there's another topic. I mean, you were part of the space agency program and you ran it for several years. We could have spent an hour talking about that. Look, I apologize, we've run out of time, but I did want to mention them and give them a shout out because I am incredibly proud of them being in my riding.
Well, thank you very much, James. I've really, really enjoyed this. And as for the Royal Astronomical Society, they're a fabulous organization.
Yeah.
Every year they come to my riding, or members who live in the riding, and they offer to show young people the stars through their telescopes and to ignite that spark of curiosity, and which I think is a wonderful service and a wonderful thing for young people to have that opportunity. So, but anyway, thank you, James, and you take care of yourself, and we'll see each other, I'm sure,
in January,
in a much better year, 2021.
Yes, and more frequently in person, I hope.
Yes,
yeah. So
I agree.
Listen, stay safe. It was fascinating. I can't tell you how grateful I am for you taking the time to do this. As I said, we could have spent the entire afternoon and we still wouldn't have covered everything, but very, very enjoyable discussion. So thank you and have a very happy holiday.
You too. Thank you.